equations. Today we're going to look at solving radical equations, specifically 3 different setups of radical equations. The first we're going to look at is when one side is radical and the other is numerical. All right, so in other words, one of the sides of my equation is underneath a radical, so x minus 4, and the other side is not, but it's also just a number. So what I want to do, and this goes for every problem we're going to do, I want to be able to write this equation without a radical in it. All right, so I need to get rid of this radical. So the first thing I want to check and see, is there anything multiplied to the front of the radical or added or subtracted to the end? If there is, then we have to make sure that the radical is by itself. In this case, it's not. All right, so the way that we get the x minus 4 out of the radical is I'm going to square the left side, everything on the left side. And whatever I do to the left side, I also have to do to the right. So that gives me x minus 4 equals 16. Notice that once I squared both sides, my radical is gone, and this is now a little bit easier problem to solve. So I add 4 to both sides, and I end up with x equals 20. Now the first few examples we're going to look at, we're going to solve by hand. But when I get to the more complicated ones, I'm going to use Desmos. So example number 2 of this scenario, I have 2 square root of x plus 2 equals 20. Now notice this time there is a number multiplied to the front of the radical, so I need to get rid of this. There's nothing added or subtracted outside the radical, just this multiplication. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2, so that I now have the square root of x plus 2 equals 10, because that divides to be 1. 20 divided by 2 is 10. And now I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Once I have the radical by itself, I can square both sides, and I end up with x plus 2 equals 100. So now, once I get to x plus 2 equals 100, subtract 2, x equals 98. For the next one in this situation, we're going to have 3 times the square root of x minus 3 minus 2 equals 1. Now, notice the difference between this one and the other ones. I have a number multiplied in front of the radical, but I also have something added or subtracted at the end. This is going to be the first thing I'm going to get rid of, because I can't divide by the 3 that's in the front until this plus or minus 2 has been taken care of. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I now have 3 square root of x minus 3 equals 3. All right, from here, I can now divide by 3. Divide by 3. That gives me the square root of x minus 3 equals 1. Once I get to the square root of x minus 3 equals 1, now I am ready to square both sides. All right, the square root of the square of the square root of x minus 3 is x minus 3, and that equals 1. Now I can solve for x by adding 3 to both sides, and I end up with x equals 4. All right, in the next scenario, we're going to look at solving when both sides are under a radical. Now, we're specifically going to look at ones where the entirety of both sides is under the radical. Now, for our purposes, we're going to look at a situation where everything under both sides is under a radical. All right, my first step is to get rid of the radical. So if I square one side, I also have to square the other. Notice I'm doing a radical squared, radical squared. So by doing that, that's what gets rid of my radicals on both sides. Once I get here, I am now just solving this equation. I'm going to subtract x from both sides, and I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So x minus x is 0, 2 plus 4 is 6, 4x's minus an x is 3x, and negative 4 plus 4 is 0, divide by 3, x equals 2. Did you know a flock of crows is called a murder. Now we're going to look at solving when one side becomes a quadratic. We're going to use Desmos to help us out because we can do it on Desmos faster as long as we follow these first steps. All right, so for my first example, I have the square root of x plus 3 equals x minus 3. All right, now, just like before, I need to get the radical gone before I can solve for x. All right, so I'm going to square this left side, and that gives me my x plus 3. Here's where it changes. If I square the left side, I have to square the right side. All right, so that gives me parentheses x minus 3 squared. All right, this, if I were to FOIL it out, would give me a quadratic. But I can use Desmos to help me out. I'm going to do y equals x plus 3 in the first line of Desmos, and then y equals parentheses x minus 3 squared in the second line for Desmos. All right, now what you'll notice is that they're going to cross twice. And I end up getting x equals 1 and 6.
As I said, in the first line, we're going to type in y equals x plus 3, which gives me a linear graph. And in the second line, I'm going to type in y equals parentheses x minus 3 parentheses squared, which gives me a quadratic. Now, if I look at my graphs, I can click on the dot where they cross. They cross at x equals 1 and x equals 6. So that is the solution to this particular radical equation, which we solved by doing a system of equations.
For the next one, it's very similar to the first. I have 3 times the square root of x minus 4 equals 2x minus 28. Now, notice that I have a 3 in front. Just like before, I have to get that radical by itself before I can get rid of the radical. So I'm going to divide both sides by 3. Notice I'm dividing everything by 3, and this is going to stay like this. All right, so this gives me the square root of x minus 4 equals 2x minus 28 over 3. So now I have to get the radical by itself, square both sides, square both sides. And now I have x minus 4 equals, parentheses, 2x minus 28 over 3 squared. Once I get to that part, the x minus 4 equals, parentheses, 2x minus 28 over 3 parentheses squared, I can type that into Desmos. So I'm going to type in y equals x minus 4 to my first line, and y equals, parentheses, 2x minus 28 over 3 squared. So I'm solving a system of equations. All right, when I do that, I'll find out that there are 2 x values that make this equal each other, and that is 10.25 approximately and 20.
So to solve, I'm going to type in y equals x minus 4, which once again gives me a linear graph. And then I'm going to type in y equals, so y equals, parentheses, parentheses, just so I can make sure it looks right, 2x minus 28, close parentheses, divided by 3, parentheses, and then squared. So if I look at my graph, once again, I have a quadratic and a linear, which means there's 2 possible solutions, 10.25 and 20, as we said just a moment ago.